It was supposed to be a secret rehearsal, a dress rehearsal for the largest amphibious invasion in history. But on the morning of April 28, 1944, off the southern coast of England, Operation Tiger turned from preparation into catastrophe. Before a single soldier reached Normandy, nearly 750 American servicemen were already dead, lost not to German defenses on the beaches of France, but to a string of fatal mistakes on the shores of their own allies. The operation was centered on Slapton Sands, a quiet stretch of Devon coastline whose shape resembled Utah Beach in Normandy. The area had been evacuated months earlier, over 3,000 villagers forced from their homes under strict secrecy. What they didn't know was that this coastline would host one of the most disastrous and least publicized events of the war. In the early hours of that fateful April morning, 8 American LSTs, landing ship, tanks filled with soldiers from the 1st Engineer Special Brigade and elements of the 4th Infantry Division began their mock assault. Many were young and inexperienced, barely 20 years old. They expected simulated gunfire and dummy explosions. What they got was live ammunition, and an enemy far more lethal than they'd been warned about. The exercise began with confusion. Due to a miscommunication between the US Navy and the British fleet, the convoy used outdated radio frequencies. As the ships moved into Lime Bay, they were left exposed, without their planned destroyer escort. That's when fate struck. A German E-boat squadron from Cherbourg, patrolling the English Channel, picked up the convoy on radar. Swift, small, and armed with torpedoes, the German boats moved in. Within minutes, chaos erupted. LST 507 took the first hit, engulfed in flames as fuel and ammunition ignited. Survivors recalled jumping into burning water, their uniforms melting as oil spread across the surface. LST 531 followed, hit directly amidships, the explosion tearing the vessel apart. A third ship, LST 289, was badly damaged but managed to limp back to port. In total, over 700 men drowned or burned to death, more than many Allied units lost in entire campaigns. Survivor accounts from the day paint a picture of unpreparedness and horror. Private Frank Meader, who survived by clinging to debris for hours, later wrote in his journal, "It wasn't the enemy that killed us. It was our own mistakes. We were training for war, and war found us first." Many men died not from their wounds, but from hypothermia, weighed down by lifebelts worn incorrectly around their waists. When they jumped into the sea, the flotation gear flipped them upside down, face first into the freezing water. But the tragedy didn't end there. The disaster was quickly covered up. General Eisenhower feared that news of the incident would jeopardize D-Day morale. Or worse, alert the Germans to the invasion timetable. 10 officers who knew the invasion plans were missing at sea. For days, Allied command feared they had been captured and that the entire Overlord operation was compromised. Only after their bodies were found did Eisenhower give the final go-ahead for D-Day. Officially, Operation Tiger was classified for decades. Families received vague telegrams that their sons were lost at sea during training. The full scale of the disaster didn't become public knowledge until the 1970s, when a local man named Ken Small discovered wreckage off Slapton Sands. His investigation led to the recovery of a Sherman tank, still resting beneath the waves, and a renewed inquiry into what really happened that morning. Even now, historians debate the true casualty count and the chain of command errors that led to it. Some suggest that secrecy itself killed those men, that in trying to preserve the invasion's surprise, the Allies silenced every alarm. Others see Operation Tiger as a grim but necessary lesson, one that saved lives during the real D-Day assault. Standing at Slapton Sands today, you can still see the memorial tank, its rusted frame a silent witness to the tragedy. The sea there remains calm, deceptively peaceful. Beneath those waters lie the remains of hundreds of soldiers who never made it to Normandy, men whose deaths were hidden, then forgotten. As the Allies pressed on toward the invasion of Europe, few spoke of Operation Tiger. It was erased from briefings, omitted from reports, and overshadowed by the victory that followed just weeks later. But in the dark history of the war, this forgotten rehearsal reveals a haunting truth. Before triumph came silence. Before D-Day came disaster, and this would not be the last time the Allies buried a costly mistake beneath the sands of secrecy, because only weeks later, in Italy, another controversial operation would test the limits of both military judgment and moral conscience. High in the rugged hills of central Italy stood a monastery, serene, ancient, and untouched by war for over 14 centuries. The Abbey of Monte Cassino, founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, had survived earthquakes, invasions, and centuries of turmoil. But in February 1944, it would become the center of one of World War II's most controversial and tragic episodes, a moment when Allied bombs turned a sacred monument into a ruin, and history into a mystery that still divides historians to this day. By early 1944, the Allied advance up the Italian peninsula had stalled. German forces, commanded by the skillful General Albert Kesselring, held firm behind a formidable defensive line known as the Gustav Line. At its heart stood Monte Cassino, a natural fortress overlooking the Liri Valley and the road to Rome. Below the abbey, towns like Cassino were reduced to rubble after months of relentless artillery fire. Every Allied attempt to break through had failed. The decision that followed would define one of the darkest chapters of the Italian campaign. Allied commanders, particularly American General Mark Clark and British General Harold Alexander, believed that German troops were using the abbey as an observation post. Reports from ground units and aerial reconnaissance suggested that enemy spotters were inside the monastery walls, guiding artillery fire. Though the evidence was inconclusive, the assumption hardened into certainty. Inside the abbey, however, were not soldiers, but monks, and hundreds of Italian civilians seeking refuge. German paratroopers of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division had been ordered to stay out of the sacred grounds, and they did, respecting the Vatican's warnings. Yet, as Allied pressure mounted, political and military fears grew that inaction would be seen as weakness. At dawn on February 15, 1944, the sky above Monte Cassino filled with the drone of engines. Waves of American B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-25 Mitchells, and B-26 Marauders roared overhead. In a 3-hour bombardment, over 1,400 tons of explosives fell upon the abbey. Witnesses later described the mountain disappearing under a sea of smoke and dust. When the bombing ended, the monastery was gone. 20 centuries of history obliterated in minutes. The monks who survived described it as a rain of fire. Out of 300 civilians sheltering inside, nearly 250 were killed instantly. German troops, observing from nearby positions, watched in disbelief. One paratrooper reportedly remarked, "We could never have destroyed that symbol, but the Allies did it for us." The destruction of Monte Cassino had the opposite effect of what Allied commanders intended. Within days, German forces moved into the ruins, transforming the shattered monastery into a near-impenetrable fortress. What followed was months of brutal fighting, 4 separate battles, each more desperate than the last. The New Zealand Corps, Indian divisions, Polish II Corps, and American units all paid a staggering price to capture what their own bombs had destroyed. In his diary, a soldier from the 2nd New Zealand Division wrote, "We fought for stones and ghosts. Every inch we gained cost us a dozen lives." The mountain became a graveyard of nations, littered with broken tanks, shattered helmets, and the dead of both sides. For the Allies, it was not just a physical struggle, but a moral one. The weight of what had been done in the name of progress. When the ruins finally fell in May 1944, it was Polish troops who raised their flag atop the rubble. Rome was open and the campaign moved on. But the decision to bomb Monte Cassino left deep scars. Even years later, Allied leaders avoided discussing it in public. Official reports used careful language: tactical necessity, unfortunate collateral damage. Yet historians and Vatican archivists would later uncover intelligence memos showing that the monastery's neutrality had been confirmed days before the bombing. Some now believed the decision had more to do with frustration and miscommunication than strategy. The Allies were desperate for a breakthrough, exhausted by months of failure in Italy, and terrified that public perception of stalemate would erode morale. Monte Cassino, in their minds, became not a sacred site, but a symbol of obstruction. Destroying it felt like progress, even if the facts said otherwise. Today, the rebuilt abbey stands once again atop its mountain, a pristine replica of what was lost. But beneath its marble floors lie the remains of monks, soldiers, and civilians who perished in that inferno. For decades, veterans and historians alike have wrestled with the question: was Monte Cassino a tragic mistake or a calculated necessity that history later condemned? As Allied commanders turned their attention north toward France, few could know that even greater failures of planning and intelligence awaited them. Because later that same year, in the snowy forests of Belgium, another disaster would unfold. One that came not from misjudged bombing, but from blindness to the enemy's greatest surprise. December 16th, 1944. Dawn breaks over the Ardennes forest, silent, cold, and thick with fog. American soldiers of the 106th Infantry Division, fresh to the front and largely inexperienced, awakened to an eerie calm. For months, the Western Front had seemed almost quiet. But beneath that deceptive peace, German High Command was preparing one of the most audacious counteroffensives of the entire war. An operation so secret, so unexpected, that it would shake the Allied command to its core. This was Hitler's last gamble, and it would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was codenamed Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Its goal, split the Allied armies in two, capture the port of Antwerp and force a negotiated peace on Germany's Western Front. Hitler's generals, including Sepp Dietrich and Hasso von Manteuffel, gathered 250,000 men and over 1,000 tanks, including the fearsome Tiger IIs, deep within the mist-shrouded forests of the Ardennes. Allied intelligence never saw them coming. Despite months of signals interception and aerial reconnaissance, American analysts dismissed warnings of a German buildup. They believed the Wehrmacht was broken, incapable of launching major operations. One US intelligence report from early December even stated, "The enemy has lost all capacity for strategic initiative." It was a fatal miscalculation. When the attack began, it hit with the force of a thunderclap. German artillery shattered the silence, and armored columns surged through the fog, smashing into the thinly held American lines. Entire units were overrun within hours. The 106th Infantry, surrounded in the Schnee Eifel, fought valiantly, but was eventually cut off. Nearly 7,000 men were forced to surrender, the largest American mass capture of the war, yet official reports at the time called it a temporary withdrawal. In the chaos, towns like St. Vith, Malmedy, and Bastogne became names burned into history. At Malmedy, one of the war's most infamous atrocities occurred when SS troops under Joachim Peiper executed more than 80 American prisoners of war. Survivors who played dead later testified to the horror and to the chilling discipline of the German advance. Peiper's column pushed forward relentlessly, its tanks painted white with snow, ghost-like under the cover of winter mist. But amidst the shock and confusion, the Allies found heroes. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, led by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, held firm against encirclement. When the Germans demanded their surrender, McAuliffe's now famous one-word reply was delivered: nuts. Surrounded, undersupplied, and freezing, the paratroopers endured days of bombardment before General Patton's Third Army broke through from the south. Their defense became a rallying symbol for the Allied effort, even as thousands of others were lost in the woods. For the men on the ground, the Ardennes was a nightmare of confusion. Snow fell so thick that aircraft couldn't fly and supply lines froze solid. One private in the 28th Infantry Division later recalled, "You couldn't tell where the front was. One moment we were marching, the next, the Germans were behind us." The landscape itself seemed to conspire against both sides, visibility near zero, temperatures plunging below -20. As the fog cleared after Christmas, Allied reconnaissance finally revealed the scale of the attack. The German advance had driven a massive bulge into the Allied front line, extending nearly 50 miles westward. Though the offensive ultimately failed, the cost was staggering. Over 80,000 American casualties, killed, wounded, or captured, made it the bloodiest battle the US Army would fight in World War II. But what the public didn't know was how close the Allies had come to disaster. Declassified intelligence after the war showed that several ultra-intercepts had detected German radio silence and coded troop movements weeks before the attack. Clues that were dismissed as anomalies. Some within British command suspected deliberate downplaying of warnings to preserve public confidence in the inevitable Allied victory. The truth was, buried in reports stamped classified and forgotten in the triumph that followed, the official narrative of the Battle of the Bulge became one of heroism, and rightly so. But beneath it lay questions about why so many were caught unprepared, why reconnaissance failed, and why so many soldiers died defending ground they should never have been holding alone. The fog of war, it seemed, was not just literal, It was bureaucratic, political, and moral. By January 1945, the Germans had been pushed back, their offensive crushed. But the cost of victory had exposed cracks in Allied intelligence that few dared to acknowledge. The silence around those failures endured for decades, overshadowed by the eventual triumph in Europe. As the snow melted and the war ground toward its conclusion, another operation, conceived with similar optimism and secrecy, was already in the works. It promised to end the war swiftly, to open the door into Germany itself. But instead, it would lead to another haunting defeat. A mission remembered forever as a bridge too far. September 17, 1944. The skies over the Netherlands thundered with the roar of over 1,500 Allied aircraft. Paratroopers of the British 1st Airborne Division, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne, and Polish paratroopers of the 1st Independent Brigade jumped into enemy territory. It was the largest airborne operation in history. Bold, ambitious, and doomed from the start. Its name was Operation Market Garden. Its goal to end the war by Christmas. Its legacy, one of the most painful lessons in Allied military history. The plan, masterminded by British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, aimed to deliver a knockout blow to Germany's western defences. The market phase would see paratroopers seize a series of key bridges across the Netherlands, at Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem. The Garden phase would send British XXX Corps racing up a single narrow highway to relieve them, creating a direct route into the heart of Germany's industrial Ruhr region. On paper, it was daring brilliance. In practice, it was an operation built on hope and flawed intelligence. The skies over Holland that morning looked like victory itself. Thousands of white parachutes blossoming across the horizon. On the ground, Dutch civilians cheered, waving flags and offering flowers to the descending troops. But beneath that moment of triumph lay a fatal truth. Allied intelligence had underestimated the German presence in the area. Reconnaissance photos taken days before had shown armoured vehicles, but analysts dismissed them as unserviceable. In reality, 2 SS Panzer divisions, refitting near Arnhem, were waiting. For the men of the British 1st Airborne Division, led by Major General Roy Urquhart, the drop zones were miles from their objective. The vital bridge over the lower Rhine at Arnhem. Radios malfunctioned, supply drops landed behind enemy lines, and the terrain was crisscrossed with dikes and canals that slowed movement. By nightfall, only a fraction of the division reached the northern end of the bridge, where Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and his 2nd Battalion dug in to hold against overwhelming odds. The fighting at Arnhem Bridge became the stuff of legend and tragedy. Frost's men, outnumbered and outgunned, held for 4 days against relentless German assaults. They fought from burned-out houses and shattered windows, armed with little more than Bren guns and courage. One British sergeant later recalled, "Every street corner was a battlefield. We could see their tanks through the smoke, and still we fought." By the 4th day, their ammunition was gone. The wounded filled every cellar, and the order came to withdraw. Few made it back. Meanwhile, the American 101st Airborne was fighting desperately to secure bridges near Eindhoven, while the 82nd struggled to take the crossing at Nijmegen. Each success came at a terrible cost, as British XXX Corps, the armoured spearhead, meant to reach. Arnhem in 2 days, crawled, forward under constant German counterattacks and traffic, jams along the single-lane Hell's Highway. The plan that required perfect timing and coordination unravelled, with every mile. By September 25th, it was over. The survivors of the British 1st Airborne were evacuated across the Rhine under cover of darkness. Of the 10,000 men who had dropped near Arnhem, fewer than 2,000 returned. The rest were killed or captured. Civilians who had welcomed them just days earlier now faced German reprisals. The dream of ending the war by Christmas lay in ruins. For years, Allied leadership portrayed Market Garden as a partial success. Official briefings emphasized the courage of the troops, the temporary gain of ground, the lessons learned. But classified after-action reports told another story. One of ignored intelligence, conflicting orders, and political pressure to achieve a symbolic victory. Montgomery himself admitted privately that the operation had been 90% successful, a statement historians would later call tragically ironic. Why was it pushed so hard? Despite doubts from senior officers like American General Omar Bradley and Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder, Some historians suggest rivalry, the desire for a British-led triumph after months of American-dominated victories in France. Others believe it was pure optimism, the belief that the enemy was broken and that audacity alone could win the day. But audacity could not cross the Rhine. Even today, the Dutch town of Arnhem bears the scars of that gamble. The rebuilt bridge stands where Frost's men made their doomed stand, now known simply as John Frostbrug, John Frost Bridge. Beneath its steel arches, quiet memorials list the names of those who never came home. Every September, locals still lay flowers and whisper the same words. A bridge too far. Operation Market. Garden revealed a truth that wartime leaders seldom admitted, that even the strongest alliances could falter under pride and misjudgment. Its failure cost thousands of lives and delayed the Allied advance into Germany by months. Yet, in its shadow, other operations remained even more deeply buried, their full stories hidden behind layers of classification and loss. Because 2 years earlier, on another European shore, the Allies had already suffered a devastating lesson in overconfidence, one that would be rewritten, redacted, and almost erased from memory. It happened not in Holland or Belgium, but on the beaches of France, long before D-Day. It was called the Dieppe Raid, August 19th, 1942. The grey dawn broke over the northern coast of France, where the English Channel met the fortified port of Dieppe. Hundreds of Allied landing craft churned through the waves, carrying over 6,000 men, mostly Canadians, alongside British commandos, American Rangers, and a small contingent of Free French soldiers. The operation was codenamed Jubilee. Its objective: seize the port, gather intelligence, destroy coastal defences, and withdraw within hours. It was meant to be a test, a rehearsal for the eventual invasion of Europe. But what unfolded that morning would become one of the most devastating and controversial failures of the entire war. The planning began months earlier under British combined operations. Led by Lord Louis Mountbatten, pressure was mounting from both Stalin, demanding a second front in Europe, and from Churchill, eager for a show of strength. The Allies needed to test the feasibility of amphibious assaults against heavily defended ports. Yet the operation's premise, to land troops directly on a fortified harbour without heavy naval or air support, defied the very lessons of modern warfare. The raid's assault force was largely composed of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division, proud volunteers who had spent years training in Britain but had yet to see major combat. Their spirits were high. They believed Dieppe would be their moment of glory, a swift strike, a victory to prove their worth. Instead, they were sailing straight into a killing ground. At 4:50 a.m., the first wave approached the pebble beaches east and west of Dieppe. Immediately, flares lit the sky and German coastal batteries opened fire. The element of surprise, the operation's most critical asset, had been lost. A chance encounter earlier that night with a German convoy had alerted the defenders. Now, every gun along the cliffs was aimed at the sea. The tanks of the Calgary Regiment rolled off their landing craft, Churchill tanks, specially modified for amphibious operations. But the shingle beach trapped their treads. Many bogged down in the soft stones or were destroyed before they could even fire a shot. Infantrymen of the Royal Hamilton Light Infantry and the Essex Scottish Regiment charged across open sand under relentless machine gun fire. A few reached the seawall, but most were cut down before making it 10 yards inland. The beaches ran red with blood within minutes. Further west, British commandos managed limited success, capturing gun positions at Puys and Pourville. But the main assault on Dieppe itself was chaos. Communications failed, artillery support was minimal, and the Royal Navy, unable to approach closer due to shallow waters, could offer little help. In the skies above, the Royal Air Force engaged in one of the largest dogfights of the war. Over 100 aircraft lost on both sides, but air superiority did nothing to save the men trapped below. By 9 a.m., it was clear the raid had failed. Withdrawal was ordered, but for many, it was already too late. Landing craft were destroyed as they approached the beaches. Others were forced to retreat half empty, leaving men behind. Of the 6,086 troops who took part, 3,623 were killed, wounded, or captured. Over 900 Canadians died that morning. A generation of soldiers lost in a single disastrous gamble. The shock in Ottawa and London was immediate, but what followed was silence and spin. Allied leaders, unwilling to admit the scale of the failure, issued statements describing Dieppe as a valuable reconnaissance in force. They claimed lessons learned would guide future landings, and in truth, many would. The need for overwhelming air cover, preliminary bombardment, and specialized landing equipment. Yet for the families of those who died, the explanations rang hollow. For years, questions persisted. Why had the attack gone ahead despite glaring risks? Declassified documents decades later revealed something darker. Some historians argue that Dieppe was more than a test. It was a covert intelligence mission. Buried within the operation's objectives was a task assigned to a small Royal Navy signals team, led by Lieutenant Commander Ian Fleming, the future creator of James Bond. Their goal was to seize German Enigma codebooks and cipher machines from a naval headquarters in the port. If true, the raid's public purpose may have been a cover for a far more secret objective, one that failed catastrophically when the commandos were killed before reaching their target. Those who survived carried the scars for life. In his memoirs, Private Gordon Lobb of the South Saskatchewan Regiment recalled, "We were told it was for training, but when the guns opened, it felt like suicide." Another wrote simply, "We landed with hope. We left with ghosts." In later years, some officials justified Dieppe as a necessary sacrifice, a grim rehearsal for D-Day. Indeed, the success of Normandy owed much to lessons learned in failure. But for the men who fought there, and the country that sent them, that justification came too late. Canada's faith in its commanders and the trust between allies were shaken. Today, the beaches of Dieppe are quiet. Pebbles washed smooth by the tide still bear traces of shrapnel. The cliffs are dotted with memorials to regiments, to nations, to men whose bravery outlived the purpose of their orders. The tide that morning washed away their footprints, but not the questions. Why was it launched? Who knew the risks? And how much of the truth was buried afterward? The answers, like so many from the hidden history of the war, remain obscured beneath the layers of strategy and secrecy. As the Allies moved past their losses and toward victory, these failures, from Dieppe to Slapton Sands, were quietly sealed away in classified reports. But even as Europe celebrated liberation, there lingered a deeper realization. Some battles were fought not just on the field, but in the shadows, and when the war finally ended, those shadows remained. Silent reminders that victory often demands a price too high to be spoken aloud. May 1945. The guns of Europe finally fell silent. Crowds filled the streets of London, Paris, and New York, waving flags and singing songs of victory. The Allied triumph over Nazi Germany was complete. The long, brutal war had come to an end. Yet beneath the jubilation, behind the parades and headlines, lay another story. One not of victory but of secrecy, of operations erased, rewritten, or quietly ignored. The battles the Allies tried to hide. For the soldiers who had lived through disasters like Dieppe, Arnhem, Monte Cassino, and Operation Tiger, peace brought little comfort. Many had survived only to find their experiences omitted from official accounts. In the rush to celebrate liberation, stories of miscalculation, failed intelligence, and needless sacrifice were buried beneath polished narratives of heroism and destiny. The public wanted victory, governments wanted unity. The truth, often, was neither convenient nor welcome. The classified reports began to gather dust. Documents stamped "top secret" were filed away in London's Public Record Office and Washington's National Archives. Some would not be opened for half a century. Inside them were after-action reviews that contradicted the official line. Evidence of warnings ignored, of orders issued in error, of human lives lost to pride and haste. Even the soldiers themselves, when asked to recount what had happened, were told to stick to the official version. One intelligence officer's diary entry, declassified only in the 1990s, reads, "We were ordered to say it was a success, even when it wasn't. The public must never know how close we came to failure." That phrase, repeated in various forms across the Allied war effort, became an unofficial creed of wartime secrecy, not to deceive the enemy, but to reassure the home front, to preserve morale, to maintain the illusion that every sacrifice was part of a flawless plan. In reality, the path to victory had been paved with mistakes. Operation Tiger's tragedy on the shores of Devon taught the Allies how unprepared they were for amphibious assault. Monte Cassino revealed how easily fear and miscommunication could destroy centuries of culture and countless lives. The Battle of the Bulge exposed the limits of Allied intelligence. Market Garden showed how ambition could blind even the best commanders. And Dieppe, the raid that never should have happened, taught them that lessons bought with blood are never forgotten. But why were these stories hidden for so long? Part of the answer lies in wartime censorship. During the 1940s, newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic were bound by the Allied propaganda code, which forbade the publication of information that might weaken the will to fight. Reports of friendly failures or excessive losses were strictly edited. Photographers who documented disasters like Dieppe or Arnhem saw their film confiscated. Their negatives never resurfaced. For the families of the dead, truth arrived in the form of silence. Another reason was political. The post-war world required heroes, not doubts. The United States and Britain emerged as victors, but also as new global leaders in a fragile, rebuilding world. Admitting to costly errors, to missions that failed catastrophically, risked undermining that image, so the stories were rewritten. Operation Tiger was renamed a training accident. Dieppe became a valuable rehearsal. Monte Cassino's bombing was described as unfortunate but necessary. And Market Garden, a near success. It took historians, journalists, and ordinary citizens decades to peel back the layers of censorship. Men like Ken Small, who discovered the wreckage of an American tank off Slapton Sands, and Polish veterans who risked reprimand to speak about the fall of Arnhem, became the keepers of forbidden history. Through their voices, the hidden chapters of the war began to surface. What they uncovered was not shame, but humanity. Proof that even in the chaos of global conflict, truth survives in fragments, waiting to be found. Today, these forgotten stories remind us that victory is never clean. Behind every celebrated battle lies another untold, one that cost lives, reputations, and sometimes conscience. The Allies won the war, but they did so through trial, error, and at times denial. The courage of those who fought in the hidden battles was no less real, their sacrifices no less profound. They simply fought in the shadows of history, on fronts where truth was the first casualty. In the end, perhaps that is the greatest mystery of World War II. Not what happened on the battlefield, but what was left out of the story. The truth that leadership feared would fracture morale became, in time, the very evidence of human resilience. The hidden battles of the Allies are not just stories of loss. They are reminders that courage exists even when the world looks away. As we look back now, more than 80 years later, the wrecks still rest beneath the Channel, the ruins still stand atop the hills of Cassino, and the bridges at Arnhem still stretch across the Rhine, silent witnesses to both triumph and tragedy. The war ended, but the echoes of those hidden battles continue to whisper through history, asking a single, haunting question: what else was left unsaid?